Gunshots echoed across Jefferson High School at exactly 3:47 p.m., cutting through the afternoon air like thunder on a clear day. Coach Mike Sullivan was running practice with his varsity team when the first shot rang out from the main building, the sharp crack of gunfire unmistakable to anyone who'd heard it in anger before. 32 teenage boys froze on the football field, their eyes wide with terror as the sound registered in their young minds, a sound that shouldn't exist in their world of homework, prom dates, and college applications. But Coach Sullivan didn't freeze. For the first time in 15 years, Marine Gunnery Sergeant Michael Sullivan was back in combat mode. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The gentleman who'd spent the last hour patiently explaining, blocking techniques to his offensive line vanished, replaced by something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. His eyes swept the field with tactical precision, counting his players, assessing threat vectors, calculating cover positions with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this before under considerably more lethal circumstances. Down, everyone down now. His voice carried across the field with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, no hesitation, no questions. 32 teenagers dropped to the artificial turf, as if someone had pulled their strings, their bodies responding to a command tone that reached something primal and instinctive in their nervous systems. More shots echoed from inside the school. Rapid fire now, the distinctive sound of someone who'd moved beyond single-aimed shots to the kind of sustained assault that spoke to serious intent and significant ammunition reserves. Sullivan's jaw tightened as his mind automatically began calculating magazine capacity, rate of fire, and probable reload intervals. Old habits died hard, and some habits were too important to let die at all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the football field, turning the scene into something surreal. Teenagers pressed flat against green turf while gunfire echoed from the brick building that had been their safe haven just moments before. In the distance, sirens were already beginning to wail, but Sullivan knew with the cold certainty of experience that help was still minutes away, and in situations like this, minutes might as well be hours. He pulled out his cell phone and speed dialed the number he'd hoped never to use again, his fingers moving with muscle memory that hadn't faded, despite 15 years of civilian life. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Emergency dispatch. This is Coach Sullivan at Jefferson. Hi. We have an active shooter in the main building. I'm on the football field with 32 students. We need immediate response, all units and medical standby. Sir, we're already dispatching. Tell them military protocols, Sullivan interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of calm precision that came from someone who'd given similar reports under fire. Multiple casualties probable. I'm moving to secure the area. He ended the call and looked at his players. These boys who'd become like sons to him over the years, who trusted him to keep them safe on the field and prepare them for life beyond it. Tommy Martinez, whose mother packed him extra lunch every day. David Chen, who'd just been accepted to Stanford on an academic scholarship. Marcus Williams, who was the first in his family to even consider college. They were looking at him with the kind of absolute trust that coaches earn through years of consistent care, endless patience, and genuine love for their players. But today, that trust would be tested in ways that no high school coach should ever have to face. Listen to me carefully, Sullivan said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded Marines in the streets of Fallujah. We're going to move as a unit to the equipment shed. Stay low, stay together, and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you to do it. No questions, no hesitation. Lives depend on following instructions precisely. The equipment shed sat at the far end of the field, a concrete block building that would provide better cover than the open ground. But more importantly, it housed something that Sullivan had hoped never to access again, a lockbox hidden behind spare helmets and practice equipment, containing items that most people would never recognize, and that he'd prayed never to touch again. Coach, what's happening? Tommy Martinez's voice cracked with fear, his usual bravado dissolved by the reality of gunfire in his school. Someone's hurt people inside the building, Sullivan replied, choosing his words carefully. Our job right now is to stay safe and protect each other. Can you do that for me? Nods all around, even from the seniors who'd been joking and laughing just minutes before. Fear had a way of making children out of almost adults, but it also had a way of revealing character. Sullivan was proud to see that his boys were holding together, following instructions, taking care of each other. Move, he said simply. They crossed the field in a tactical formation that the boys didn't recognize, but that their bodies somehow understood. Sullivan positioned himself between his players and the school building, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his mind automatically calculating fields of fire and cover positions. The training was still there, muscle memory and tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments and now might keep his students alive through the worst day of their young lives. The equipment shed's metal door was locked, but Sullivan had the key. More importantly, he had the combination to the lockbox that sat in the back corner, behind equipment that hadn't been moved in years. He'd put it there when he first took the coaching job, telling himself it was just a precaution, just the reasonable preparation of someone who'd seen too much of the world's violence to ever feel completely safe. "Stay here," he told his players. "Stay down, stay quiet, and watch the door. If anyone comes through that isn't me or a police officer, you go out the back window and run for the tree line. Don't look back, don't wait for each other, just run." "Coach, where are you going?" David Chen's voice was steady despite his fear, the same steadiness that made him a natural team captain. Sullivan was already moving toward the lockbox, his fingers working the combination with automatic precision. "I'm going to make sure nobody else gets hurt." Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved with the kind of care that some men reserve for family heirlooms, were items that represented 30 years of military service and hard-won expertise. A tactical vest that had stopped shrapnel in 3 different countries, night vision goggles that were obsolete by current standards but still functional, communication equipment that operated on frequencies not monitored by civilian agencies. And at the bottom, wrapped separately in a cloth that had once been part of a flag that had flown over a forward operating base in Afghanistan, was a sidearm that had saved his life on more occasions than he cared to remember. 45 caliber pistol that had been his constant companion through deployments, in places where American soldiers weren't supposed to be conducting operations against enemies who officially didn't exist. Sullivan had cleaned and maintained the weapon religiously for 15 years, even though he'd hoped never to fire it again, except at the shooting range where he practiced monthly to maintain skills he'd prayed would remain unused. Some things were too important to let deteriorate through neglect, and marksmanship was a skill that could mean the difference between protecting innocent lives and becoming another casualty statistic. As Sullivan checked the weapon and loaded a magazine with movements that were automatic after decades of practice, he could hear his players whispering behind him. They were scared, confused, trying to understand how their normal Tuesday afternoon had transformed into something from their worst nightmares. But they were alive and they were together, and they were his responsibility. 300 other students and faculty were inside that building with someone who'd already demonstrated willingness to use lethal force against innocent people. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. Every minute he spent in the safety of the equipment, she'd was another minute that people were dying. "Coach," Marcus Williams' voice was barely audible. Are you going in there?" Sullivan turned to look at his players, these boys who'd become like family to him over the years. He'd coached some of their older brothers, had watched them grow from awkward freshmen into young men who were ready to take on the world. They deserved to grow up, to go to college, to fall in love, to have families of their own. They deserved to live in a world where high school was about learning and growing, not about surviving gun violence. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "Before I became your coach, I was a Marine. I served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen things that no one should have to see, and I've done things that were necessary to protect innocent people. Today I might have to do those things again." The equipment shed fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens growing closer and the occasional crack of gunfire from inside the school building. Sullivan's players stared at him with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time that their gentle coach carried secrets that ran deeper than football strategies and motivational speeches. "I want you to stay here," Sullivan continued. "I want you to follow the instructions I gave you. If police arrive, you identify yourselves clearly and follow their commands exactly. If I don't come back, you tell them that Marine Gunnery, Sergeant Michael Sullivan, went into that building to stop a threat to civilian lives." "Coach, you can't," Tommy started to protest. "Yes, I can," Sullivan interrupted gently. "And I have to. Because that's what Marines do." We stand between innocent people and those who would hurt them no matter the cost. He looked at each of his players one more time, memorizing their faces, hoping this wouldn't be the last time he saw them alive. I love you, boys. You've been the best part of my life for 15 years. Now I need you to be strong for each other and for your families. With that, Sullivan turned and walked toward the door, checking his equipment one final time. The tactical vest fit like it had been made for him because it had been. The weapon felt familiar in his hands despite 15 years of peaceful civilian life. The training was still there, muscle memory and tactical awareness that had been forged in the crucible of combat and tempered by experience that most people couldn't imagine. Jefferson High School had been built in the 1970s, a sprawling complex of brick and steel, designed to house 1,500 students and staff. Sullivan knew every hallway, every classroom, every hiding spot that teenagers had discovered over the decades. But today that familiar territory had become a battlefield, and he was moving through it with skills that had nothing to do with coaching football. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not complete silence, he could hear crying, whispered prayers, the sound of people trying to remain invisible while their world collapsed around them. But the gunfire had stopped, which could mean the shooter was reloading, changing position or selecting new targets. None of the possibilities were good. Sullivan moved through the corridors with the tactical precision of someone who'd cleared buildings in Fallujah and Kandahar, his weapon ready but pointed safely downward, his eyes constantly scanning for threats and for innocent civilians who might be caught in crossfire. The familiar smell of the school, cleaning supplies, teenage body spray, the lingering aroma of cafeteria food, was now mixed with something else, something that took him back to places he'd tried hard to forget. Blood, cordite, fear. The first body he found was in the main hallway near the administrative offices. A teacher he recognized but didn't know well, a woman who'd always nodded politely when they passed in the parking lot. She'd been shot multiple times and had died, trying to shield a student who was nowhere to be seen. Sullivan said a quick prayer for her soul and continued moving, his mind automatically cataloging details that might prove tactically relevant. The shooter was using a semi-automatic rifle, probably an AR-15 or similar platform, high-capacity magazines, based on the number of spent brass casings scattered across the hallway floor. The shots had been fired from a standing position, suggesting someone with at least basic training and reasonable physical condition. Most importantly, the shooting pattern suggested someone who was selecting targets rather than firing randomly, a calculated killer rather than someone in the grip of pure rage or psychosis. That made him more dangerous but also more predictable. Professional killers followed patterns, made decisions based on tactical considerations, responded to threats in logical ways. Sullivan had spent years learning to think like such people, to anticipate their moves, to position himself where he could neutralize them before they could harm innocent civilians. Sullivan heard them before he saw them, hushed voices coming from the science wing, where advanced placement classes were held after regular hours. He moved toward the sound with tactical precision, using cover and concealment techniques that had kept him alive in considerably more hostile environments. 3 classrooms were barricaded, their doors blocked with desks and filing cabinets in the way that teachers had been trained to respond to active shooter situations. But barricades only worked if the attacker couldn't get through them. And Sullivan could see that the shooter had been testing the defenses, looking for weak points and ways to bypass the obstacles. One classroom door showed evidence of attempted entry, bullet holes in the wooden frame, splintered wood where someone had tried to force their way inside. Sullivan could hear voices from within, students and teachers trying to remain quiet while their improvised fortress was under attack. That's when he saw the shooter for the first time. The man was young, probably early 20s, dressed in tactical gear that suggested either military training or careful preparation. He carried himself with the kind of purposeful movement that spoke to some level of training and significant advance planning. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of violence. This was a calculated attack by someone who'd prepared for exactly this scenario. The shooter was positioned outside the classroom door, methodically working to breach the barricade, while the people inside remained trapped and terrified. He had his back to Sullivan, focused entirely on the task of getting to his intended victims. It was the kind of tactical error that spoke to tunnel vision, the loss of situational awareness that could prove fatal in combat situations. Sullivan moved closer, using cover positions that allowed him to approach without being detected. His weapon was ready, his mind calculating angles and backstops and the 100 other variables that determined whether a shot would neutralize a threat without creating additional casualties. He'd made similar calculations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but never in a high school hallway lined with lockers, decorated with homecoming photos and college recruitment flyers. "Federal agent, drop your weapon!" Sullivan's voice echoed through the corridor with the kind of authority that had once commanded Marines under fire. It wasn't technically true. He wasn't a federal agent. But it might confuse the shooter, long enough to gain tactical advantage. The young man spun toward Sullivan's voice, his rifle coming up in a movement that was trained, practiced, and very nearly fast enough, but not quite fast enough to matter. Sullivan's first shot took the shooter center mass, a textbook example of marksmanship training that had been maintained through 15 years of monthly practice sessions. The impact staggered the young man but didn't drop him. Body armor, Sullivan realized, noting the tactical vest that had absorbed most of the bullet's energy. The second shot was higher, more precise, placed with the kind of surgical accuracy that came from years of training and the absolute necessity of ending threats quickly and permanently. The shooter dropped to the hallway floor, his weapon clattering away across the polished tiles. His threat to innocent lives terminated with extreme prejudice. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded the confrontation. This was the silence of shock, of minds trying to process events that existed outside normal human experience. Sullivan moved forward carefully, checking the fallen shooter for signs of life, while keeping his weapon ready in case. This was some kind of tactical deception. But there was no deception. The young man was dead. His plans for mass murder ended by someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to stop such threats with minimal risk to innocent lives. Sullivan felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory or vindication. He felt only the familiar emptiness that came after taking a human life, even when that life had been forfeit through the choice to threaten innocent people. From inside the barricaded classroom, he could hear voices, whispered conversations, someone crying, the sound of desks being moved away from the door. Sullivan stepped back and called out in the calm, professional tone that he'd used to reassure frightened civilians in war zones around the world. "This is Coach Sullivan. The threat has been neutralized. Police are on the way. Stay calm and follow their instructions when they arrive." The classroom door opened slowly, revealing faces that he recognized, students from his school, teachers who'd worked alongside him for years, people who'd never expected to see their football coach, standing in a hallway, with a smoking weapon and a dead body at his feet. They stared at him with expressions that cycled through relief, confusion, and dawning comprehension of what they just witnessed. "Coach?" The voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh, the chemistry teacher, who'd organized countless fundraisers for the football team. "Is it over?" "It's over," Sullivan confirmed, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. The immediate threat was ended, but the consequences would ripple through their community for years to come. These students and teachers would carry the memory of this day for the rest of their lives, and some of them would struggle with trauma that might never fully heal, but they were alive. That was what mattered. They would go home to their families, graduate from high school, go to college, build careers and relationships and all the other experiences that defined human existence. The young man on the floor had tried to steal that future from them, and he'd been stopped by someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the personal cost. The first police officers arrived 6 minutes after Sullivan's shots were fired, responding to emergency calls from students who'd heard the gunfire and witnessed the confrontation. They entered the building with tactical precision, weapons ready, following protocols that had been developed through hard experience with similar situations across the country. What they found was a scene that would challenge their understanding of how such incidents typically unfolded. Instead of an active threat requiring complex tactical response, they discovered a neutralized shooter and a man in a football coach's shirt who was clearly something more than he appeared to be. "Sir, I need you to put down your weapon." The lead officer's voice carried the kind of controlled tension that came from dealing with situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Sullivan complied immediately, setting his pistol on the floor and stepping back with his hands visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Coach Mike Sullivan, Jefferson High, former Marine. The threat has been neutralized. One shooter down, no additional hostiles detected. The officer's expression shifted as he processed Sullivan's words and demeanor. This wasn't the behavior of someone in shock or panic. This was the professional calm of someone who'd dealt with violence before and understood how to communicate effectively with law enforcement in high-stress situations. "Sir, I need you to step away from the weapon and place your hands behind your head." Sullivan complied without argument, understanding that the officers needed to secure the scene and verify that he wasn't an additional threat. He'd been in similar situations before, though usually on the other side of the equation, and he knew that confusion and adrenaline could lead to tragic mistakes if proper procedures weren't followed. As additional officers secured the building and paramedics began treating the wounded, Sullivan found himself answering questions from investigators who were trying to piece together the sequence of events. How had a high school football coach managed to neutralize an armed shooter? What training did he have? Where had he obtained the weapon and tactical equipment? The answers came out slowly, reluctantly, pulled from a man who'd spent 15 years trying to leave his military service in the past. Marines didn't like to talk about their experiences, especially experiences that involved taking human lives in defense of others. But the investigators needed to understand what had happened, and the community deserved to know that their children had been protected by someone with the skills and courage to act when action was necessary. By evening, word had spread throughout the community that their beloved football coach was something more than anyone had imagined. Local news crews gathered outside the school, their cameras and microphones seeking the story behind the story. How had a gentle educator become the person who'd stopped a mass shooting? The answers came from military records that had been classified for 15 years but were now being reviewed by federal investigators who needed to understand Sullivan's background and capabilities. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Sullivan, United States Marine Corps, 3 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. 37 confirmed. Enemy kills in situations ranging from urban warfare to special operations behind enemy lines. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Combat V. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Combat Action Ribbon. Presidential Unit Citation. The kind of decorations that spoke to a level of service and sacrifice that most civilians couldn't comprehend. But the records also told another story of a Marine who'd been medically retired after an IED explosion that had killed his entire squad except him, of someone who'd struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, who'd found healing in the simple act of teaching young people to work together and achieve goals they'd never thought possible. He never mentioned any of it, said Principal Sarah Martinez during an interview with local television. In 15 years, he never once talked about his military service. He was just Coach Sullivan, the man who remembered every student's name, who stayed late to help kids with their homework, who made sure no one felt left out or forgotten. The story that emerged was more complex than simple heroism. Sullivan had come to Jefferson High, seeking peace and purpose after experiences that had left deep scars on his soul. He'd found both in the daily routine of teaching young people, in the satisfaction of watching them grow and succeed, in the knowledge that he was building something positive rather than destroying something negative. But when violence had threatened his students, his kids, as he'd come to think of them, the warrior had emerged from behind the teacher's mask, not because he enjoyed violence or sought opportunities to use his lethal skills, but because he understood that sometimes violence was the only language that aggressors understood, and someone had to be willing to speak that language in defense of the innocent. The town of Jefferson had never experienced anything like the shooting at their high school, and they struggled to process both the trauma of the attack and the revelation that their football coach was a decorated war hero who'd saved countless lives through his quick action. Vigils were held for the victims, 2 teachers and 1 student who died before Sullivan could reach them, lives that had been cut short by senseless violence that had no place in a community where neighbors looked out for each other and children were supposed to be safe in their schools. But there were also celebrations for the survivors, recognition that things could have been much worse if not for the actions of a man who'd put his own life at risk to protect others. The football team organized a ceremony honoring their coach, though Sullivan tried to decline the recognition, insisting that he'd simply done what anyone would have done in similar circumstances. "That's not true, and you know it," said Marcus Williams during the ceremony, speaking for his teammates and the entire student body. "Most people would have run away or hidden. You ran toward the danger because that's who you are. You saved our lives, and we'll never forget that." The investigation into the shooting revealed that the attacker had been planning his assault for months, accumulating weapons and ammunition, studying the school's layout and security procedures, preparing for maximum casualties. He'd been motivated by a toxic mixture of personal grievances and ideological extremism, seeking to achieve notoriety through mass murder, but his plans had been thwarted by the presence of someone who'd dedicated his life to protecting others, who'd carried the skills and courage of his military service into civilian life, who'd been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to prevent a tragedy from becoming a catastrophe. In the weeks that followed the shooting, Sullivan struggled with the attention and recognition that he'd never sought and didn't want. Media requests, speaking invitations, offers to write books or appear in documentaries, all of which he declined, preferring to return to the simple routine of teaching and coaching that had given his life meaning for 15 years. But returning to normal wasn't entirely possible. The shooting had changed everything, not just for the community, but for Sullivan himself. He'd spent 15 years building a peaceful life, creating distance from the violence and trauma of his military service. Now that distance had been erased in a few minutes of gunfire and tactical decision-making. The nightmares returned, dreams of Iraq and Afghanistan, mixed with images of his high school's hallways, his former Marines calling to him from places where they'd died while he'd survived. The guilt was familiar, the weight of knowing that he'd lived while others had died, the questions about whether he could have done something different, something better. But there were also letters from parents, thanking him for bringing their children home safely, cards from students expressing gratitude and affection for the coach who'd risked everything to protect them, support from fellow veterans who understood the burden of carrying lethal skills in a peaceful world and the weight of using those skills when circumstances demanded action. Dr. Sarah Chen, the mother of one of his players, was also a psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans. She approached Sullivan quietly, privately, offering the kind of professional support that he'd avoided for years, but now recognized he might need. "It's normal to struggle after something like this," she told him during their first session. "You did something extraordinary, something that saved lives and prevented unimaginable tragedy, but that doesn't mean it was easy, or that you should expect to simply return to normal as if nothing happened." Sullivan found some comfort in talking with someone who understood both the military mindset and the psychological impact of violence. He'd carried his experiences from Iraq and Afghanistan alone for 15 years, but the shooting at Jefferson High had opened old wounds and created new ones that required professional attention. As the school year continued and life slowly returned to something resembling normal, Sullivan faced a decision that would define the rest of his career and perhaps his life. The shooting had revealed his military background to the entire community, ending the anonymity and peaceful obscurity that he'd valued so highly. Some people now looked at him differently, not just as Coach Sullivan, but as Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, the Marine who'd killed people in distant wars and who'd killed again to protect their children. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in how people related to him and understood his place in their community. There were job offers from security consulting firms, opportunities to train law enforcement agencies in active shooter response, invitations to speak at military reunions and veterans events, all of which would have been easier than staying at Jefferson High, where he was constantly reminded of the day when his two worlds had collided in violence and trauma. But when the football team gathered for their first practice after winter break, Sullivan knew where he belonged. These young men had seen him at his most vulnerable and most dangerous, had witnessed the intersection of his military past and civilian present, and had accepted both versions of who he was. "Coach," said Tommy Martinez after practice, "my mom wanted me to give you this." He handed Sullivan a sealed envelope with handwriting that he recognized from permission, slips and fundraising forms. Inside was a simple card with a simple message. "Thank you for bringing my son home safe. He talks about you every day, about how you taught him to be brave and to protect others. You gave me the greatest gift possible, more time with my child. We will never forget what you did for us. Similar cards arrived from other parents, expressions of gratitude and recognition that transcended the violence and trauma of that terrible day. These families understood that their coach had made choices that no educator should ever have to make, had drawn on skills that had nothing to do with football, had risked everything to protect their most precious possessions. The shooting at Jefferson High became a case study for law enforcement agencies and school districts across the country, an example of how quickly situations could escalate and how valuable it could be to have trained professionals in unexpected places. Sullivan reluctantly participated in some of these discussions, sharing tactical insights and emphasizing the importance of preparation and training. But his most important lessons weren't tactical, they were human. He spoke about the weight of taking a life, even when that life belonged to someone who threatened innocent people. He discussed the long-term psychological impact of violence, the importance of seeking professional help when trauma threatened to overwhelm healthy coping mechanisms. Most importantly, he talked about the choice that every person faced when confronted with evil: to act or to remain passive, to accept responsibility for protecting others, or to hope that someone else would handle the problem. It wasn't a choice that anyone should have to make, but it was a choice that defined character and determined whether evil would triumph or be defeated. I didn't want to be a hero, he told one interviewer, who'd managed to convince him to speak publicly about his experience. I wanted to be a teacher and a coach, to help young people learn and grow and achieve their potential. But sometimes life doesn't give you the choices you want. Sometimes you have to choose between the person you want to be and the person that circumstances require you to become. The football team had their best season in school history that year, winning their first state championship and bringing pride and recognition to a community that had endured more than its share of trauma. Sullivan credited his players' resilience and determination, their ability to focus on positive goals despite the violence they'd witnessed. But the players credited their coach, the man who'd taught them that protecting others was more important than protecting yourself. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, that some things were worth fighting for no matter the personal cost. Years later, when journalists and researchers wrote about the Jefferson High shooting, they focused on the tactical response, the security failures that had allowed the attack to occur, the profile of the shooter and the warning signs that had been missed. But those who'd been there, who'd lived through the experience, remembered something different. They remembered a coach who'd loved his players enough to risk his life for them, who'd carried the skills and courage of his military service into civilian life, who'd been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to prevent tragedy from becoming catastrophe. Sullivan continued coaching for another 10 years, watching generations of young men grow into adults, teaching them about football and about life, about teamwork and sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He never spoke publicly about his military service again, returning to the quiet anonymity that he'd always preferred. But his players knew, the community knew, and sometimes when the world seemed particularly dark and dangerous, it was comforting to know that there were people like Coach Sullivan walking among them, quiet heroes who'd seen the worst that humanity could offer and had chosen to respond with courage and sacrifice rather than fear and hatred. The memorial plaque in Jefferson High's main hallway commemorated the victims of the shooting and honored those who'd responded to protect others. It mentioned no names and provided no details, but everyone who passed it understood its meaning. Some people ran toward danger when others ran away. Some people carried skills and courage that made them capable of extraordinary actions when ordinary responses weren't sufficient. Coach Mike Sullivan was one of those people, a warrior who'd found peace in teaching, a killer who'd found redemption in protecting innocence, a hero who'd never wanted to be called by that name, but who'd earned it through choices that defined the very best of human nature. In Jefferson, Indiana, where children went to school safely and parents slept peacefully, that was enough. That was everything.